could also mean Amazon robots that are flying things to your door these days. What do you mean when you're talking about a drone?
So the thing that I wanted to focus on in the book was something I thought hadn't gotten a lot of attention, and that's a particular answer to your question. So I come from the human rights world. As you heard from the intro, I do political sociology, social movements, protests, that kind of stuff. And all of my fellow travelers are interested in the deployment of fixed-wing weaponized aircraft overseas in what is really some loopholey liminal space in international law. So is this the right thing? Does it actually work? Is it legal? All of these are sort of up in the air because we haven't had robust discussions about weaponized fixed wing, unmanned, large drones like the Predator and this sort of thing, Global Hawk. So when I first started talking about drones, I meant the small quadcopters, the sort of thing that everybody sees in their communities. And people said, I know exactly what the answer is to all the questions. And they instantly talked at me about large fixed wing platforms. And I had to have a little think, which was, do we really, just because we maybe both call them drones, is that what we mean? Is this the term that we're going to use that's going to cover all of these uses? So the very first thing I had to do was to specify what I'm talking about in the book. And it's, first of all, nonviolent drone use. And it's drone use that's being used predominantly by not the government and not by corporations, but by nonprofit organizations, activists, everyday citizens, small sort of social change-oriented startups, sort of innovative and pro-social ways of using drones. And people who think like that tend not to have the money for the big fixed-wing aircraft, even if they don't have armaments on them. So what I mean is those kind of quadcopters you see flying around and maybe are annoyed by, and not the big fixed-wing aircraft that only large corporations and governments own.
Well, and of course, we'll get to how. I appreciate you explaining that, because I didn't realize that you started with the same question I think that I had. When we're defining those terms. And then we get to the good aspect. And I guess, if I were to, taking away from reading your book and from reading what you're talking about, there are a lot of negative perceptions or perhaps scary perceptions of drones. But this book, at least as I understand it, you're basically trying to reclaim drones and say, hey, these really can be, these smaller ones that can be used for good. And they are being used for good.
Yeah, so I think in a lot of ways, if nobody had books saying anything negative about drones, then I would have suggested somebody should write that book. Maybe I would have written that book, a book that says we should be careful about surveillance, and we should be careful about privacy, and we should be careful about these as weaponized platforms. But a lot of people have already said that. And so in some ways, I felt like this book was a bit of a corrective to say, yet not no, but yes, and there are all these other cool things. And the reason I'm saying that is because if we pass policies based on our fears, we're not actually going to have the sort of interesting, innovative uses that are actually possible. And I started writing this book a couple of years ago when lots of communities were saying, you know what, these new technologies are going to invade everyone's privacy, and they're going to break a whole bunch of laws, and we better get ahead of this by passing laws before we know what the technology is actually going to be used for, because it could be bad. And I don't think that's factually wrong, but maybe I'm a bit of an optimist, or maybe I'm naive. Buy it and read the book and you can tell me which it is. But I sat down with my students at the University of San Diego, and we analyzed how are people using this technology. And what we found was that in about 15,000 reported cases of drone use, we culled through all of those, and we found like discrete uses where, it turns out if you used a drone once to rescue a kitten, there's one article. And if you use a drone once to drop cocaine into a prison, there was 100 articles. So if you strip away that kind of weighting by how much attention things got from the news, it turns out that the use of drones for spying, for invading people's privacy, and for crimes were the two smallest out of the 15 discrete uses. They're the smallest things. They're the thing nobody was actually doing. So I'm not saying it's not possible. And I'm not saying there's not good books that are saying horrible things could happen. But when we looked at the data, horrible things weren't happening. In fact, a lot of really great things were, and that's what the book's about.
Okay, well, so then let's start from the beginning, right? Because I appreciate that. You're saying that you gathered students and you researched this and you looked at data points and you combed through articles, but there was lived experience. And that, as I understand, is really what kind of kicked off this book. And you have lived experience of seeing the power of good that drones can produce.
Yeah, so that data that we looked at came out of a hunch I had. I didn't know what we were going to find, but it came out of a hunch I had. And I got that hunch, as your question is alluding to. I sort of came into this question because a few years ago, I got my first academic job, and I was living in Budapest, Hungary at the time. I was working for this wonderful university, Central European University. And I was teaching a class on human rights advocacy. And I could have taught a class on policy analysis and memo writing for political impact, which is not my thing. So I said, let's do something different. Let's kind of shake it up. And together with the students—
You wanted to get in trouble. That's what you're trying to say.
I wanted to get in trouble. That's what actually, now you've caught me. So I thought, let's see what we can do that's a little bit different and actually pushes the envelope a bit. And drones were just starting to be widely available. And we can talk more about the technology if anybody cares, but essentially there's a whole new range of technologies. You started out by asking about these small quadcopters. They've got the brains of a smartphone in them. That's all you need to know. They've got everything that's in your smartphone is plugged into it, something that's got a bigger battery and propellers. So that's all that it is. So that was starting to take, that technology was starting to be widely available when I started teaching the class. So I said to the students, listen, I'm a scholar of social movements, protest, and we know that when lots of people turn out non-violently for protests, social movements win. And so let's use the drone to better estimate turnout in crowds. And so that's what we did. And we went to every protest we could find. And all the protests that were happening at the time, I'm sorry to say, were like very small and very sad. And so we had a drone to monitor like 8 people who were all standing around. We could have done that just driving by, said 8 people. But we had overkill technology for the crowds at the time. Just so happened that after we had kind of gotten our estimation method up and running, our drone in the air, we had our legs under us, the largest protests in Hungary happened since the fall of the Berlin Wall happened. And there were tens of thousands of people on the street. And the earlier protests we were documenting were protests around equality and rights and sort of traditional left-leaning issues. Not a lot of people turned up. But the people turned out in the tens of thousands on the streets because the government had proposed not a left sort of policy or right policy. They proposed taxing the internet. And this, as it turns out, upset corporations. It upset, left-wing people, right-wing people, old people, young people. Everybody was upset. And so everybody turned out on the streets. And we happened to have been there capturing this imagery with the drone. So we worked with independent journalists and with the media, and we had from the drone. So there was imagery from the ground, complemented by imagery from the air, and those like images together told this larger story. So that when sort of the state-leaning press and media said there were the same old cranks and anarchists on the streets, our footage suggested that there were lots of people actually. And a couple of weeks later, even more people turned out, and we did this, ran the numbers, it did some estimation. It turns out something like 60,000 people had turned out. That's about 3.5% of the population, and there's very important work by Erica Chenoweth at Harvard that suggests if 3.5% of the people turn out non-violently, they win. Guess what? It's what happened. So it's kind of confirmed this hunch that I had that the drone could be used to estimate the size of crowds, but it led to a larger question, which is the one we were just talking about a minute ago. How are drones being used? Because everything I looked for in the literature said they're being used for evil and to spy and to steal. So that's why I had to run these tests and with my students to figure out if that was even true.
Well, and I'll pause for just 1 second. I mean, as we're talking, everyone out there, please give us your questions, because in just a little bit, we're going to be asking them as well to Austin. We can't let him out of the hot seat that easily. So just please, we encourage your questions as we come. Austin, it's so interesting you say that, and that 3.5% number really struck me when I was reading it, because you're absolutely right. So often, two things happen. People or governments or police officers, whoever it may be, try to say, this is how many people were demonstrating. This is how many people care about this issue. This is how many people are out on the street. And if you are a reporter like myself who is on the street and all you can see is this little box of what is happening, it's hard to say. It's really, really hard to say. And I'm just thinking about, and I don't want to, we'll get into the now in a second, but I'm just thinking about what's going on in Portland, right? Where we're seeing everything through a little box, and policy decisions are being made off of what we're seeing on TV in a little box, when that drone image, that just being able to show what the reality is, that you are cracking that 3.5% to demonstrate there is a movement happening, to validate that. I mean, that's that makes a whole difference. I mean, that really does.
So one of the things that struck me as I was working on the book is this point exactly. So much of the technology I mean, I've got a bunch of books behind me, and half of them are about the importance of social media, hashtags, how cell phones, smartphones, and social media have fundamentally disrupted political communication. And what they've done is they've allowed us to tell news stories on the ground that we weren't able to talk about previously. So I feel like there's really solid scholarship on that. But what struck me was that part of the story that I'm telling you right now in Hungary was the fact that we had this compelling imagery, and even more people turned out. When they thought they weren't going to be alone, more people turned out. And this is important for political communication. But I also think that we need to talk about technology and politics, or the politics of technology, or technology's impact on politics, because it also technology has an important impact on raising the cost of doing things the way we've always done them, raises the cost of the status quo for whoever's in power. So we have two things all of a sudden, right? Just to take the current moment, let's just take Portland. One question is, how many people are out there, and is it a representative size? And what stories can we tell? This is an important thing to talk about in terms of communication. But there's also people, I mean, these leaf blower guys have really captured my attention, because we also have all this human creativity, not around, is it going to make it to social media, and not around, is this going to get more people out for the cause, but just how can we redirect wind so tear gas blows that way. And it sounds a little crazy, but that's a technology story too. And we don't think of leaf blowers I didn't think of leaf blowers as a social movement technology until this week. Neither had I ever thought about traffic cones, putting traffic cones over tear gas, so it sort of siphons out chimneys out the top. Human creativity is like off the charts cool in my estimation. And I'm trying to document that about drones, but also I think the punchline is there's a bunch more technology that's out there that's really changing this equation between the powerful and the powerless. As a social movement scholar, it's that balance that I really care about.
Yeah, and it's reimagining things. And there was something you wrote as well where you noted the idea of, if the only tool you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. Well, if you only, and you were saying the same thing about iPhones. Well, an app is the only solution to anything. If you don't even yet know all the things that a tool can do, whether it be a leaf blower or a drone, I mean, the possibilities really become endless. Okay, awesome. So I want to continue forward, just because I think this stuff is so fascinating. We have a drone at NBC7. We have a drone. It's called Drone Ranger. We branded everything right. But there are restrictions as to when and where we can fly the drone. There are, FAA regulations. There's airspace rules that we follow pretty religiously. Do regulations like that hurt the idea of being able to use drones for good?
This is a really great question. And I think that where I come down on this is local control. And so one of the things that concerned me very early on, so I told you the story about Hungary, had this whole event. What happened at the end of all of those people turning out on the street, and so the way that this wrapped is we were flying our drone over the crowd, and my research assistant is on the phone, and we're talking to the organizers of the protest. We say, when we fly our drone over the crowd, we want everybody to turn their cell phones with their lights up at the drone. And so standing
concert with
concert 101, the new generation. And so everybody does this and points their phones up at our drone, and there's a stringer for the New York Times right next to us. And he takes that picture, and that picture is the next morning on the cover of the International New York Times. And what happened was the Hungarian government was embarrassed, and they backed off of the policy. The people on the streets won. That 3.5% really mattered. The policy was dropped. We're really happy about that. And about 6 weeks later, we got a phone call from the Ministry of Transportation that said, we're going to have a conference about drones, and you're an expert. We'd like you to come and speak. So that doesn't sound good to me. And so I went to the event, and the whole event was an announcement that they were passing new legislation that drones should not be flown over any place where there is a police activity. And so let's just pause there for a minute, right? Why did they pass that law? Well, because they got embarrassed politically, right? And fairly internationally. But let's ask, is it a bad law? And the answer is no, it's not bad that, do we want to stop drones from flying? The drones can fly everywhere. There's a puzzle, this is like a dilemma that you're bringing up, which is, We are both talking right now in San Diego. If you look, the current laws say that you can't fly within 5 miles of an airport, but all of San Diego County, there's no place that's not within 5 miles of an airport.
And not just the airport. I mean, we've come into issues where you can't fly by Miramar. I mean, it's military and airport all in the same. I mean, yeah.
So it's incredibly complicated. What I'm not trying to say is there should be no laws. I'm saying that the public should be involved in making those laws. Because the thing that I'm afraid about, frankly, is that Homeland Security will be able to fly a drone over any protest, and Amazon will be able to deliver, a packet of pens to my house in under an hour by drone. But then if you as the press, and I as a researcher at a university, want to use this technology for good, to raise public awareness about the news, your job, and to tell a larger story about things humans are doing with one another for good, we can't do it. So if our community says we don't want anything in the air, then, and the informed public have spoken, I'm in favor of it. So I'm not coming down in favor of open skies and everybody should have drones imposed in their communities, not at all. I'm saying we should have big conversations about what's in the sky, and corporations, governments, and the people should all have a say in that, not just the first two categories of folks.
Well, and it just goes to that point again, where if the goal is, the democratization of whether it be surveillance or this type of technology, once again, this situation where clearly the companies and the government have said, we see the value and we are going to fight to regulate so that we can use it. And now it's just getting the public to also see how it is valuable to we, the people. Right? I mean, that.
Yes. And that's why I'm hoping that the dive that my students and I did into all of these news reports, but then channeling it down to how many cases of these were discrete, unique cases. And when we did that, we found, and I already mentioned this, but the bad actor sort of uses got hundreds and hundreds of picked up in the media. They got lots of different stories. And the other ones that were cool and pro-social maybe got mentioned once. But if you just look at what kinds of uses there are out there, I think we're social creatures. I mean, maybe it's because I'm a sociologist, but I think we have social norms. And right now we don't have social norms about how to use drones, but we can develop them. And I think that we need to sort of take a step back and wait to see how people innovate before we regulate too quickly. And that's a kind of a weird thing, professors are not known to be saying we need to hold off on government regulation, but here I am.
But to just pull that thread once more, and this is something that we talked about before we got on the Zoom today, what was interesting to me is, again, in the news story of drones are bad and people should view them as such, I remember it was not too long ago where Chula Vista Police Department made a big splashy show saying that they have guns, basically. I don't think they shoot projectiles. You can maybe correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not sure if they shoot projectiles, but they're almost like laser guns of sorts that can ground drones. If they see what the intent is, if they see a personal drone that is in somewhere they don't like, they can shoot it down. I mean, what do you make of that?
So I have a whole chapter connected to, that asks the question, how to hide from a drone, how do you shoot a drone down, how might your drone get shot down, that sort of thing. I don't no recommendations here, but
That's right.
I have some information about best practices.
Umbrellas.
So one of the puzzles here is that you're exactly right, and this is the kind of thing I'm concerned about. So Chula Vista is a community here in San Diego County. The police department has drones, and they also have anti-drone tools. So let's ask ourselves in the moment we're in right now, do we want the police to have the ability to capture surveillance footage with no public accountability? But when public accountability tables are turned, and then the people want to watch and see how their taxpayer dollars are spent in the form of policing, their technology is removed from the air. Now, I know maybe we don't want to have a drone flying over us, and we feel sympathetic to that, but this is the equivalent, again, of removing a flying smartphone from the air. So this is the equivalent of me walking up with my phone to record a police-civilian interaction, and the police having something that just turns off my cell phone. That's what we're talking about here. That's the analogy.
Right.
So I'm not saying that the police department should or shouldn't have any of these technologies. I'm saying let's have a robust public debate. My opinion is they shouldn't have this technology. But if the public says, we have got a crime issue, we trust the police, we have a citizens review panel for all of this footage, then let the community do it. What I'm not in favor of is police departments that can just use military-sized budgets to buy things to monitor people, and people have no say over where the data goes, no say over where the body cam footage goes, no say over where the drones can fly, or where that imagery is archived. That's an accountability problem.
And man, you're speaking as a journalist, you're speaking my language, man, in terms of just making sure that accountability is there. Because again, and I keep saying this term because I love it. I think it's well said. Is again this democratization of surveillance, and you think about George Floyd and the protests that ensued, and that movement began because a piece of technology was in the hands of people, and it wasn't filtered or dictated by a government, by an authority, or anything like that. And that's what you want for drones, right? I mean, that's the idea.
I'm with you on that. And again, maybe I'm dispositionally in favor of that framework or way of thinking, but I think it's supported by the data. And I keep coming back to this. We ran the data, and people, before there were any laws anywhere, people were not, there are bad actors out there, and there are bad people doing bad things with technology. So I'm not saying there's nothing. So I'm going to don't hit me in my DMs and say, here's the link to something bad. I know it. It's in our data set. The point is that when you adjust and average all of this stuff out, people are using these technologies for more good than they are for harm. And so I know in the book, I talk about drones, and I also talk about satellites, balloons, and kites. So if you don't like how anti-accountability a drone might seem, you can put a GoPro on a balloon and everybody can go, what the heck is that? Follow a string down and come and ask you what you're doing. And then you can answer the question. So there's other ways we can get sort of eyes in the sky, so to speak. And also, these are all technologies that can hold platforms other than cameras. We can put other things up there as well. But I want everybody to have that capacity, and not just the powerful, and certainly not just the armed powerful or large corporations.
We have a bunch of questions. I'm going to get to those in just 1 second, and please keep them coming. I'm seeing them here; they're all great. But I'm going to use this last question that I have for you, Austin, kind of as what I think will be a bridge to some of the questions that I'm seeing already coming in. So this is the case you're making for the good drone, for the good public we the people use of the drone. But man, and this is what we started off the conversation with. This moment with mass protests, the government, not just local government, the federal government have used drones, and not necessarily just the four-wing, I mean, you would know more than I would in this, to surveil these huge protests that we've seen. What should be our takeaway there?
That's a great question. So I have a long-standing commitment. In classes, I will stand in different parts of the room based on what I'm representing. If I'm speaking purely empirically, and this is just the data that we have and there's no debate, I'll stand in one part of the room. And if I'm telling you something that's iffy and there's a huge debate about it, I'll stand in the middle. And if I'm giving you my opinion, I'll go stand over there. So I'm going to sit over here and tell you what my opinion is. My opinion is that we should not have the sort of large-scale surveillance that essentially is in place in the United States. You go to any sort of demonstration, protest, or any event, there's sort of stinger boxes and stinger modules that are there that harvest everybody's cell phone information. And
this is happening. This is happening right now.
So this is a different side of surveillance, but the state has incredible tools in its surveillance portfolio. That makes me uneasy. It makes me uneasy as a libertarian or as a leftist or just as a person with kids. I don't care about the political spectrum. It should make us uneasy regardless of where we are, left or right on the spectrum. And so that in my mind, when all of a sudden you have, forget whether or not you support Black Lives Matter, which I do, but I don't want to live in a place where the state surveils people who have differences of opinion with the government. And so that's kind of like, I'm standing over here in my opinion, that's where I sort of step off and say, or that's where I get off the train or whatever, how to finish that metaphor. And I think that it's not just me. I think that's just something that across the political spectrum, we should be able to agree on. Even if you think citizens shouldn't have drones and all of that, that's fine, disagree with me, but we shouldn't be surveilled in our homes, outside our homes, and on the street when we engage in the everyday actions that were granted to us by our forefathers politically, which is to raise our voices when we disagree with things. That's a right that we have as citizens, and when we let the sort of the surveillance state impose itself on us, I think it has a chilling effect. So it's not what the book is about, but that's my soapbox. I'll get off it now.
Sure. Well, I appreciate that. I mean, it is, but again, that's why you say, I mean, I don't want to use words that are, unnecessarily aggressive in nature, but again, that's the argument, right? That you can combat these mediums of surveillance by governments, by police, by different authorities with good drones and good use, and if not combat, at least contradict or provide a different perspective that you wouldn't otherwise have.
I agree. And I think there's a democratization process in a lot of these technologies that some of the implications in the book are not just for drones or for tools and technologies more broadly. So just as I started by saying, there's this weird moment we're in where there's lots of books about social media, but not as many books about all these other techniques and sort of technologies that make the status quo uncomfortably costly for whoever's in power. That's what social movements have always done. That's what the American Revolution was. We just made having 13 colonies too expensive for King George. That's what this was. And the Civil Rights Movement made sort of Jim Crow laws too expensive for southern states. And that's what protests are trying to do right now, is make police brutality too expensive for police. So if that's what we think of as protests is doing, then raising awareness is important, but raising the cost of business as usual is critical as well. And so whether or not that's getting out the word through telling a news story from the air, or it's adopting new forms of technology, I'll go back to the leaf blower because I love it right now, adopting new forms of technology that put power into the hands of the people. Those are the sorts of questions I think in the book I'm trying to wrestle with and encourage us to think with optimism and creativity about our opportunities to engage for the people.
You anger the moms protest, and when the moms leave, the dads come with the leaf blowers. All right, let me get to some of these questions right here on Facebook right now. So Justin Vincent Prue, he asked about your perspective on drones in terms of their usage of surveillance in today's protests. I think we just covered that. Liz Toby Cairn, forgive me, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, writes in, what books would you recommend to a junior scholar in terms of writing on disrupting social or political norms? This is someone who's excited to read your book and just looking for more places to turn if they want to look at, learn more about these subjects of disruption.
So this is a great question. There's a whole bunch of answers out there, but I'll tell you what book is like on my nightstand right now. And it's this book right here called Becoming Good Society. And it is a book about what's going to happen in human rights over the next decade or two as new technologies come online. And so it really asks questions about how we want to start thinking about the sort of society that we want to have. Now, there's a whole bunch of other answers that are like, how do we work on norm change, and what's the best way to persuade people to think differently? And I'm happy to answer that if you hit me up by email. This is the book, I think, on that topic that's on my nightstand right now.
That's great. Again, clearly such a not polarizing, but again, provocative subject right now in this moment, and one that folks like I should read probably as well, to some reporting on this stuff. Okay, I got a question from Kevin Dobbins here. Kevin says, Austin, thank you for doing this. Do you see the possibility of drone highways? There are companies currently working, and do you see the privatization of drone airspace happening? This is something I'm not familiar with.
This is a great question, and I think this is the next, again, I mentioned earlier that when it comes to public policy, I think that individual communities should be the ones making these decisions. I'm not trying to say drones are great for your community or drones are awful for your community. I'm saying people should decide. That's my consistent argument here. It's like for the people. There's this larger, that commitment though is in a little bit of tension with larger infrastructure decisions, right? I mean, the fact is, if you're going to build a highway, that highway from the East Coast to the West Coast is going to cut through a whole lot of farmers' farms that don't want that to cut through the farmers' farms, which is why we have eminent domain laws. So there's this tension between community, sort of private rights and community of public opinion, and then these larger national projects that take initiative that doesn't always take into consideration these like smaller or like sort of more specific voices. So I think that's a big conversation we're about to have, because I live in a community here in California that doesn't like power lines. And so we've buried all of the power lines under the ground so you can see the supply. Why? Why is it that people don't like to see like sort of wind turbines off the coast of, you know, the Hamptons or Cape Cod or, you know, in the Bay Area? Well, it's because people want to look out and see forever off into the sunset or the sunrise. That's why they, you know, are living next to an ocean. So we're going to have a really, I write a whole piece on this in the book. We're going to have a really tough conversation when it comes time to actually talk about right of way for drones in the air, because they're not going to all fly willy-nilly. They're probably going to fly in the sorts of, was it Kevin who had this question? Yeah, they're going to fly in these sorts of channels. And this is going to help keep them at the right altitude and out of the way of other aircraft, as we were discussing here in San Diego. How are we going to decide that? Whose voices are going to get heard, and how is it going to justly pass sort of universally, not just zigzagging through poor communities, for example, because they didn't have a lawyer to sue whoever it was that was putting together that highway in the air? These are big, big, big questions, but they sound like traditional politics and not like crazy new politics, even though it's kind of crazy that they're in the air.
God, that's so crazy to me. Again, some of that personally not consider. I mean, yeah, I mean, this will eventually become an infrastructure, right? If not forced by we the people, forced by Amazon. You know, someone will force this conversation, and yeah, I'm envisioning, you know, Wall-E here of things zipping all over the place. And you know, if you just looked at today's, you know, hearings on Capitol Hill with so many tech CEOs and how sometimes older elected leaders aren't necessarily savvy with those technologies, I can only imagine what a local city council committee might be doing when it comes to determining drone infrastructure. And
especially if public opinion is informed by a lack of knowledge about how drones are actually used. So again, I'm not saying that they're always used for good or that there are no legitimate concerns, but what we do know is when it comes to public opinion, there's lots of uncertainty. And so the polls are all over the place, they're changing over time, and folks have like initial fearful reactions that sort of diminish over time. So we're nowhere near having a good sense of what the public feels about this technology sort of stabilized out. And so I think that's going to take some time as well.
Jim Stone here writes, he has a comment, but I'm curious your take on it. Jim Stone is saying that the drone sector is very male biased. And that perhaps if there were more women basically involved in drone research, we might see more positive uses of the technology. Do you have a thought on that? Have you come across that in your work?
I think that's probably true of every industry.
Right, of every field, every industry. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, a change that couldn't come soon enough. So I think that there are, I touch on this, I mentioned it already, but I touch a little bit in the book. I don't do it from a gendered perspective, but there really is this sense that drones and satellites are like an eye from nowhere. There is, and not to get to, I mean, I don't know, Jim, or if this answer is going to resonate, but there's a whole literature in the academic world about the idea that white men have this idea of neutrality, and they're just telling the facts like they are. And it's everyone else that has a lens, a framework, or a perspective. And that's taken decades to challenge and to begin to overthrow. And so what I think there's a risk here in thinking that drones and satellites just tell the truth, and it's just the facts. And we lose sort of perspective on the way that they in themselves are manifestations of power. Who can buy a drone? Who has control of the airspace? Who got the permit? Who's willing to obey the law? Things you and I have touched on in a couple of ways here. So in some ways, drones and satellites are really linked in with larger conversations about power. And I think that's one area. And then I mentioned this earlier, but the fact that kites and balloons, two additional technologies that are in the book, the fact that they have strings sounds so silly and so simple, but at the end of the day, you can see the thing in the sky and then follow the string to the ground and see who's there and talk to them. Maybe they're mean, maybe they're nice, maybe they're doing something you don't want them to do. Anyway, there's somebody there. And I think that kind of like line of accountability is the opposite of this view from nowhere, just it's kind of a sense that there's just disembodied eye of God science that's out there. And it says, no, we're people situated in the moment that we're in. So that can get a little bit wonky, I know, but I think that there's a lot more there to be explored. And it's only really going to happen if we have more diversity, both at the R&D level, which is I think where the question was coming from, but also at the owner and operator level, and then also at the analysis and sort of theorizing level, which is kind of where I live.
again, I mean, it's been around for a little while, but we really are talking about a new technology and how people react to it, and it's still new enough that we're we're still learning not only how public perception is of it, but how people will react to, again, as you're saying, operators, people who are developing it. There's so much to keep going and to keep uncovering. All right. I have a question from Daniel Leonard here. Daniel writes, are there significant privacy concerns that may pose particular risks for individuals protesting by losing anonymity? So could drones, even in the hands of protesters, harm them? And, I'll say, I remember during a lot of the mass protests, there were people who were saying, don't share photos of people's faces, or don't, take photos of people's faces, because even that, in the hands of us posting on Instagram or social media, whether it's camera or drone or whatever, even that can be harmful in some way.
That's a great question. So when I first sort of walked away from that initial experience in Budapest that I described at the top of this conversation, the first thing I did was dug around and said, I'm an academic, I'm going to write a short piece about this technology and how it should be used. And in fact, I could find no sort of best practices, ethical, around ethics, sort of ethical guidelines for documenting protests and documenting like contentious political activity, how to work with communities, how to enter a community respectfully, lots of great stuff on that. But when it came to the thing we were doing, which is kind of like politically edgy and risky in some ways, there were no best practices. And so what I did, the first thing I did was publish an article and said, here's some great ethical, here's some ethical guidelines. And they were great because they're the only ones, and also here's how we actually used our drone. And so what we did, for example, just to take that case one step further, go dig in that a bit more, is we didn't fly below a certain altitude. We didn't go low enough so we could see people's faces, for example.
Interesting. Now, you were making those conscious choices.
Yes. And because they were protesters out on the street, and we didn't know where this was going to go. We didn't know the movement was going to be, or the protests were going to be successful. We didn't know the government wasn't going to meet that large turnout with force. We didn't know. So we were very careful. And when we first published all of this stuff, we did it anonymously, and we did it through back channels. And so we weren't sure where it was going to, what was going to happen. And so one thing that we made sure we did is kept folks' anonymity by flying at a certain altitude. That's the story I'm telling you. Is it true? The fact is, I'm asking you to trust me, and we have no way to verify. You can come, I share the footage, you can go see it online, but there really isn't accountability baked into any of our systems. And this is a really incredible tension. So while I'm saying we should be using drones to hold the powerful to account, this question points to an opposite risk, which is if you get in close enough to see the officer who's doing who's mistreating somebody, let's say, then you're also seeing the 5 people who are in the mix in that moment. And I think that's an ethical decision that's like really complicated. And it's complicated if we've got smartphones on the ground. It's complicated if we've got drones in the air, additionally complicated because they're dangerous up close to people. But those are the kinds of conversations I'm saying aren't easy to have, and you should copy what I'm saying, but we're debates we need to have so that we can decide on policies together. But those are certainly risks. It's a great question.
Well, and I appreciate you saying that, because that is the comparison, right? I mean, we in the media, we are given video sent to us on smartphones every 16 seconds, and it's then incumbent on us to do our due diligence to verify, to make sure it's real, to there is a process there. And I guess the goal is if we can at least normalize the use of drones by people, then we can work what is I don't want to say real or fake, but what is what is real video or not, and in that way, at least, we can start to, once it's normalized, then we can almost have the, moral guidelines. But I guess you would say we should probably have moral guidelines in place before we start flying drones everywhere.
I think these things come around. I think that these are, and I keep saying, like, I think people and communities should decide for themselves. So I think that there's evolution, co-evolution that's really what I would favor and prioritize. But yeah, I think we need to have sort of guidelines to start out with. But at the risk of sounding just like incredibly Pollyannish, I think those guidelines are generally those social norms we practice one with the other. And so the fact is that I mean, this is maybe like, this isn't TMI, but like, I don't use my smartphone to spy on people, and I don't use a drone to spy on people. And the people who might use a drone to spy on people might be the same people who use, smartphones to spy on people. We have peeping Tom laws, and we have good ways of holding those. Well, maybe I shouldn't say good. We have ways of holding those people to account, and those people should still be held to account. Having a new way for them to be creepy is the nature of technological evolution, or if you believe in it, advancement. That's what we get. And so we're having this conversation about drones. We could also have it about smartphones, our lives online, whether or not we should be really letting our IP address out there. We could be having this conversation about credit fraud, the dark web. We're in this world. But really what drones do is put all of this technological innovation into the air. And it raises all of those puzzles by the power of, like, an additional dimension, which is the air. So I don't know if they're brand new puzzles.
They're definitely not brand new puzzles, but it seems the difference is that first, as we've been discussing, you're starting out with the perception that it is bad or something worthy of suspicion, much more strongly than perhaps people were when smartphone cameras came out. Perhaps. I don't know.
Yeah, I know. I think when smartphone cameras came out, there were some people who were nervous about them, but a lot of people were enthusiastic. And people who lost their enthusiasm for, let's say, ubiquitous smartphone technology might be the first people to say, we don't need this technology in the air either. And I'm not, and my pretty consistent point is not that they're wrong, but that a larger conversation about what this really means is in order.
All right, we have time for one or two more questions. This is from Beth Dunlap. She asks, what have initial reactions been to your research from various communities, such as social justice organizations or tech companies or law enforcement?
That's a great question. So a lot of folks have the initial, from the very beginning, a concern that what I'm talking about are large fixed wing aircraft. And as soon as they realize that's not what I'm talking about, the concern is that the same rules apply, that we should very quickly develop very strong rules in order to make sure that there are no bad actors doing bad things. And while I'm in favor of that approach for large fixed wing weaponized drones, I'm nervous because that when my colleagues in sort of human rights and advocacy circles say the exact same thing as the federal government and the police, it makes me nervous.
Sure.
And when they both say this technology can be used for I don't know, for bad, for ill, I don't think that's wrong. I just want to make sure that we have a balance of power in terms of the tools that the people have and vis-a-vis the powerful. And I don't want to live in a world where the powerful have all the tools, where the rich, where Jeff Bezos and the federal government or a state government or my local police have tools that help them evade accountability while keeping me on the line. I don't like that. And so that's my concern, but that has raised the hackles then of some folks who say, we really need to shut down all forms of surveillance and turn them all off. And I'm not opposed to that philosophically, but again, that's not the world we live in. We live in a world with like a dark web and with, credit card fraud and with all sorts of complicated technologies. And I'm saying, you don't have to agree with me, but I'm saying human rights folks should be in the mix innovating. Great groups like witness.org have been on the cutting edge of this sort of thing for a long, long time. Open Society Foundation's been on the cutting edge of this sort of stuff for a long, long time. And I think that's what's really most important, is that we are in the mix. And the fact that not all of my colleagues agree with me, I think we'll see. We'll see in 10 years what's happened. And maybe I'm wrong. And I'm eating my words with another book where we talk again.
But also, again, why defining the terms and being absolutely clear as well is so important, I think. Before we start to wrap things up, I gotta ask this question from Amanda at Warwick's. She wonders, is there any speculative science fiction writers that have informed or inspired your work?
What a question. Yes.
I like that.
That's a great question. So there's a new volume out called The People's History of the Future. I'm going to get it wrong. I'm so sorry. I'm doing this on the fly, but it's a riff off of Howard Zinn's The People's History of the United States, and it's about American futures, and I think it's super interesting. It's like speculative political futurism, and I think it's really, really cool. So that's I'm glad I came up with that off the top of my head, but it's also true.
Amanda Warwick, she knew you would have an answer. She knew you'd have an
I
answer.
hope, and you can get it from Warwick's. I promise you. Just call them; they're going to have it.
That's right. That's very well said. I guess just the last thing, Austin, and thank you so much to everyone who asked questions and who participated. I know that Austin and I could field these for quite some time, and I appreciate all of them. What do you hope when people finally read the book? What do you hope to take away? What's the main thing they hope to leave with?
One thing, and we spent most of our time talking about it here, that I hope people come away with is a broader appreciation for a wider range of technologies beyond social media. And so social media is important, but especially since 2016, it seems like sometimes it's all we talk about. So I want us to think about leaf blowers. I mean, to take this point. And so I want us to think in broader terms about technology and about technological innovation, because I think there's a lot of human creativity that goes into asking new questions about how we combine the stuff we have in the moment we're in to fulfill our objectives. And it's fundamentally like a creative enterprise and a creative effort. So if we think about the world as being just the way that it is and has to be, I think we don't get as much out of life. And so there's something about human creativity, courage in the face of whatever moment we're in that looks for the resources we have on the ground in that moment. That's really like inspiring to me. And I think that's the larger punchline in the book, not just like drones are going to be really great, I promise you, but together creatively, we've got this. And I think that's the encouraging moment that I wrote the book in. And these are hard times, but I think I still feel that way.
Dr. Austin Choi Fitzpatrick, the good drone. Thank you so much for taking the time. We have a guest back with us. Julie has rejoined us. Yeah, thank you for sharing so much.
Thank you, Danny. It's been great. Thank you so much.
That was a fantastic conversation. I mean, we could have, like you said, Danny, we could have let this go on for another hour, I think, because there was lots of good stuff going on in the chat I was noticing too. Austin, do you have a copy of the book you can hold up to show everybody?
I do have a copy of the book I can hold up and show.
Excellent.
It looks like this. There's a satellite, there's a drone, there's a balloon. It's all there.
It's all there. I don't know if Danny, if people want to follow you on do you have a social media channel that you participate in?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. You can find me all at Danny E. Freeman. And of course, as Julie mentioned, Sundays on NBC7, Politically Speaking. We have tons of leaders all the time from locally and around the state and the country. So please join us.
Tune in for that. It's a great show. I love that show. And then Austin, for you, I know we talked about not sharing IP address, all that, sharing your information, but if you'd like to share your information.
There's what I say, and there's what I do. I'm sorry, they're two different things. So I'm A. Choi Fitz, ACHOI-FITZ, everywhere, absolutely everywhere. So if you Google it, Twitter, email, everything, and I'm open to chat and love talking to people about these things. So.
Excellent, because I noticed that there were some questions that didn't get answered on the comment field. So either if, you can go back and look at that, or if people want to reach out to you and ask those questions onto your other channels, they can do that as well.
Julie, can I hop into the Facebook Live after this is over and answer some questions?
They won't be live anymore, but you can go to the thing, you can go to it and answer those questions.
Awesome, I might do that, thank you.
Yeah, they won't be live, but you can actually, and they'll get notification that those are there. So again, that's a good question. If you joined us late, this will stay on Facebook Live, so you can go back and see it from the beginning. I also recorded it, so I'm going to put it on the Warwick's YouTube channel as well. Again, the book is available at Warwick's. Danny, we appreciate your time. Austin, another great event with us. So with that, I'm going to say goodbye to everybody on Facebook.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Danny. Warwick's team, you're the best. Thank you.
Okay, we are off.